somehow no apologies to those who have the Magnificat Missal or Living with Christ. I've chosen these readings from the Franciscan lectionary today. It happens. It's good to keep you on your toes. Well, St. Francis met the Lord when he embraced the leper and in praying in front of the San Damiano cross. St. Clare, however, found God in the poverty of contemplation, and she in turn never swerved from her way of life, her life's mission, to the end of her earthly life. For Clare herself, poverty and contemplation were so intimately intertwined that contemplation presupposes poverty, because the Lord promises and gives the kingdom of heaven only to the poor. Yesterday, Father Tom spoke about the treasures of the church on the feast of St. Lawrence, and how St. Lawrence brought the treasures of the church to the emperor. That would have been the poor, the widows, those whom the church supported and cared for. They are the true treasures of the church. We continue in that same theme today. As with Francis, Clare's poverty is not for its own sake, but because it makes present the kingdom and because of an ardent desire for the poor Christ crucified. Always at the poor Christ image, Clare determined to gaze upon. It was always the face of Christ crucified. It was her desire to contemplate it because he is the image of God. Jesus Christ crucified was the image of God's love for us, the mirror in which we are asked to contemplate. We are the earthen vessels spoken of in that reading today. This image of the mirror is central to St. Clare's spirituality. As St. Francis was the mirror of Christ, and Christ the mirror of the Father, so the life of contemplation is to look into the mirror that is Christ and see yourself, to see yourself there, and to learn who you are. By looking into the mirror who is Christ and recognizing yourself, you become a mirror of him, of Christ, whom you contemplate. And you in turn mirror, through Christ to the Father, all of creation. Just recently, we moved the statue of St. Clare back into the chapel, and I have the joy of having her in front of me, behind you. But if you take the time to look at that statue today, she bears the San Damiano cross with a mirror upon it, with the image of Christ crucified, that crucified face out of love. And when we see that mirror, we see ourselves. We see how we can be called to mirror Christ crucified. St. Clare wrote to her sisters, "For the Lord himself has only placed us as an example, as a mirror for others, but also for our own sisters," she said, "whom the Lord has called us to our way of life, so that they in turn will be the mirror and example to those living in the world." For me, the most striking reality that this imagery confronts us with is the poverty of God. The poor Christ is the image of the Godhead. God is poor, God in his self-emptying. We hear in the Philippians hymn, God so loved the world that he gave us his only Son, that he emptied himself out of power to be a human being with us in all things but sin. This crucified Christ shows us how we can become mirrors of God. Poverty, then, is not an end in itself. It never can be, but a way of becoming transformed into the image of the Trinity by contemplating the mirror of the Trinity and Jesus Christ himself. As a mirror is material, yet holds an immaterial image, this is spiritual, so the poor Christ is human and visible. yet is an image of the invisible God, who is poor, in Trinitarian self-emptying that is simultaneously a filling up of grace and peace. And it's fitting that I began with that St. Francis met the Lord in the leper and in the San Damiano crucifix. And from its earliest days, that chapel of San Damiano, where the San Damiano crucifix was found, it became the center of not the friars, but of Clare and her sisters. So the Clares, the poor Clares, always had the original San Damiano crucifix in their convent. And when they moved from the convent of San Damiano in the lower valley, they brought it up to the Basilica of St. Clare. It's not the original is not in keeping of the friars, although we're pretty greedy about it, but it was given to Clare and her sisters to contemplate Christ crucified so that they could better mirror the love of God, the poverty of God. And so we too, when we come to this chapel, we have the opportunity to see the love of Christ crucified in love of us. And we are then called, maybe challenged, to mirror Christ for others.